Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the US Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization.
Hi.
Hello, Johnny. Good to see you.
Nice to be seen. I apologize, but this is the first one of these interviews I'm doing like Jerry Seinfeld. I'm driving because there was crazy stuff going on at my house. And so I don't know, this could be really cool, and then it could be a dud, but you look great, so that's the most important thing. How are you?
Doing all right. It has been a busy time leading up to the elections in the United States, but we have been quite active with the US Transhumanist Party and with our presidential candidate Charlie Cam and vice presidential candidate Liz Parrish.
So tell me, well, before we even get there, tell me who you are and give me some interesting but concise information that gives our viewers an indication of who you are.
Certainly. So my name is Gennady Stolyarov II. I'm the chairman of the United States Transhumanist Party. I am the author of Death is Wrong, which is the world's first, and as far as I'm aware, only illustrated children's book on indefinite human life extension. And throughout my life, since the age of 5, I have sought to dedicate much of my time to endeavors to combat human aging and death and disease. And while I'm not a scientist or a researcher in biotechnology, I am a philosopher, an advocate, and I am involved in transhumanist politics. I would like to see transhumanism become the new paradigm for human civilization so that human societies embrace the vision of technological progress as being able to overcome virtually all of the problems that humankind faces and has faced throughout its history. And of course, the problem of human mortality is the greatest one of them all. So the US Transhumanist Party was founded in 2014 by our mutual friend, Zoltan Istvan. And in November 2016, Zoltan asked me to become the next chairman of the US Transhumanist Party after he finished his presidential run, and he wanted to move on to other activities in the political and journalistic sphere, but he wanted the Transhumanist Party to continue as an organization and to grow. And so he asked me to essentially become the next leader of the Transhumanist Party and build up its membership, be inclusive, be a big tent organization, not take one side of the political spectrum or the other, but rather find ways to unite people around these shared goals of making a brighter future through science and technology.
So just so we can get our terms and our definitions straightforward, when you talk about transhumanism, give me the sort of basic definition, and then give me a sense of the inclusive or the platform in which the transhumanist society sort of sees its raison d'etre, as it were.
Certainly. So transhumanism is the philosophy and movement that seeks to improve the human condition and overcome the barriers to human life, human well-being, human prosperity by the application of science and technology. And in a certain way, humans have always been transhumanist. It has always been part of human nature to overcome our limits. We certainly don't live the same way our hunter-gatherer ancestors lived. However, transhumanism as an explicit philosophy and movement really goes back to the middle of the 20th century with such thinkers as Julian Huxley and, of course, FM 2030, whom you have known very well. And the goal of transhumanism is to really remove all of these age-old limitations to human life and well-being, the most significant being biological aging. But there are other limitations too, like material scarcity and human conflicts, human psychological flaws, cognitive biases, irrational emotions. Transhumanism is very much a philosophy of rationality, and through rational discourse about ethics, technologies that could assist in those realms, we would like to see the human species overcome its internal flaws as well and rise to a new level of being, essentially. So
I guess where things become a bit tricky is, like, I think if you ask anybody, you know, we list whatever challenge: poverty, climate change, income disparity, what are some of the others? Obviously, this crazy political system in which we are very much a part of right now in the United States. I mean, so it's how we do those things that I think is the thing that fractures organizations, political movements, etc. Because I don't think there's anybody that doesn't want to have more abundance or live longer and better. So it's the how. So tell me the how of transhumanists and why you think it's, well, what are the challenges that haven't enabled it to become mainstream? I mean, and I bring this up a little bit because FM, in a way, didn't want it to, was happy for it not to be mainstream because his job was to project into the future. Whereas you, on the other hand, and me, though I don't necessarily define myself in one particular way, you know, does see these things, wants these things, and wants them now, or at least some of them. So what are the impediments to this?
Well, I would say the main impediment is a simple lack of public awareness. It's interesting because people in the media, people in academia, people who have time to read the writings of FM 2030 or Ray Kurzweil, they generally have an understanding, at least at a basic level, of what transhumanism is. If you look out at the general public, though, the people whose primary concerns are understandably their immediate day-to-day lives, many of them just haven't encountered the term. So when one talks to them about transhumanism, they ask, well, what is transhumanism? And then one has to give this kind of basic explanation. I would say, apart from people who have been influenced by Alex Jones type conspiracy theorists or bio-Luddites, bioconservatives, both of whom are a fairly small minority in contemporary Western societies, mostly people's attitudes toward transhumanism are a blank slate. And potentially anything can be written on that slate, depending on who is articulating the messages of transhumanism, whether these are friends of the philosophy or detractors. But I would say we have a situation where it is not easy, despite the proliferation of online media, to really reach the majority of the public, because there are barriers to entry that the mainstream media have erected, and also the two-party system in the United States, of course, actively tries to keep out competing ideas, competing organizations with ballot access laws that are intentionally almost impossible to overcome, or lack of media coverage to third parties, lack of ability to participate in televised debates unless one organizes one's own. So these are the kinds of barriers that make it necessarily a slow process to build this public awareness. Now, we have made a lot of headway. I would say since I started in the transhumanist movement, and my involvement in some fashion dates back to 2004 when I discovered the works of Aubrey de Grey and Ray Kurzweil, I have seen perhaps growth by 2 orders of magnitude in the number of people who are aware of what transhumanism is and who are sympathetic. But it's a process of essentially building up this awareness one person at a time, or a few people at a time, a few public appearances at a time. If you put on a conference, especially a virtual one where people can attend, or you do an interview, you do a live stream, you write an article, you have a piece published in a newspaper, a few people each time will learn about transhumanism from those venues. And then some of them might become interested, some of them might join the Transhumanist Party, some of them might join other organizations, and that's how the movement grows. Now, it is difficult for a lot of people because people are struggling today. We have a worldwide pandemic. We have a lot of people who were in financially precarious states before then, and we have the other societal challenges that you mentioned. So I would say the greatest benefit for people in terms of being able to be exposed to these ideas is just having some spare time where they could seek out the literature, they could watch the conversations, they could educate themselves. But in a situation where everyone is pressed for time, that's harder to do, although I think we're all trying our best to still spread the word.
Now, there's one thing for it to be a viable philosophy, for it to be a movement where it solves some of these problems. I mean, I think a lot of critics, and to some degree, I mean, I think there is at least a notion that technology is going to be the panacea for all our ills. I mean, how much do you subscribe to that sort of idea? And then if it's not just technology as a panacea, what are some of the other solutions that transhumanism or the Transhumanist Party that you're now the chair of offers?
Yes. So I would say technology is a necessary part of the solution, but it's not a sufficient part of the solution. Certainly, we need technology to overcome the limits on human lifespan and also to produce the radical abundance that will solve many of the pressing material issues of our time. However, technology also needs to be applied in the right ways. There are some technologies that are quite destructive that the Transhumanist Party opposes. For instance, weapons of mass destruction or engineered viruses or technologies of mass surveillance. However, if technologies are supplemented with rational discourse, then we can go a long way to resolving these problems.
I'm laughing, rational discourse in today's, I mean, the thing that I guess is anxiety provoking for me is that somebody who loves technology and really thought that the internet was going to help us come together and work on things together and bring the world together, sees how it's been used to fracture and disseminate disinformation and lies, and we're living in sort of a post-fact world. I mean, so how do you explain the dissonance between the promise of the technology and where we are today? I mean, I know how FM would have probably tackled this, but I'd love to hear in your words.
Certainly, and I sympathize with the remarks you just made. I myself have the same observation that especially over the past 5 years, there has been a most unfortunate fracturing of our society. These social media filter bubbles lead to essentially a lack of common ground of facts for people to relate to when discussing contemporary issues and seeking to resolve them. And I think the problem stems from the design of a lot of the social media ecosystem, how the platforms are developed not to advance some sort of shared pursuit of truth, but rather to keep people maximally engaged. And the architects of those platforms in various ways have determined that maximizing kind of affective emotional responses, which sometimes are hostile responses or responses built in fear or anger or suspicion, would be the most effective way to keep people engaged. So it's possible to have a different architecture of these kinds of platforms. I would say the early internet was better for that purpose because there weren't these social media walled gardens that tried to keep people in. Rather, there were millions of independent websites and forums and communities, each of which had a different flavor, but there was a common system of navigation among them. And so people could very freely jump among them. And that still exists today. The problem is the social media companies have become very adept at kind of pulling on the psychological levers, exploiting the evolved flaws of the human psyche. And I think it's a very—
I love, sorry, I beg your pardon. I love this commentary and I love these ideas. I mean, the issue to me is the financial one. I mean, and there are those in the transhuman movement that are very libertarian, let's say. I mean, there's a very libertarian sort of thrust. And again, there's some aspects of that that I love. And then there are other aspects that don't, to me, make sense. And part of it is, you're right, like if these were set up with a different architecture, perhaps with a different value set, they would work not, I was going to say as intended. I guess as intended would have been to make money, so they are working as intended. But as intended from a truth basis, or at least a community basis, or at least with the idea of forming robust intellectual fact-based communities. Now, how do you incentivize, in a system, again, where certain, not just the transhuman, but that has a very sort of libertarian thrust, particularly in Silicon Valley anyway, how do you incentivize the powers that be to want to create such a community when actually they say in terms of their philosophies that they do, but obviously that's not the case. I mean, we're seeing it play out. We saw it play out in our last election. We're seeing it play out in Europe. We're seeing it play out in many other countries. And so I'm sorry that I'm giving you sort of practical problems, but yes, what are the solutions of incentives? I can't even say the word.
Yes. So how to incentivize the search for truth and constructive behavior on social media? That's a great question. And I would say there are some models that work, some organizations that have been successful at that. For instance, Mozilla Firefox created a browser that is essentially based on open source concepts and user privacy and security, where they intentionally say not only are they going to not track the user, but they're going to block other websites and applications that try to track the users. Or DuckDuckGo, which is a search engine that essentially promises complete privacy of one's search history, which is great for individuals. And I think it's important to understand, even for people with a libertarian persuasion, and certainly we have a lot of those in the transhumanist movement, money is not the only value. If you have money, but you don't have privacy, you don't have the dignity of the individual, you don't have the comfort of knowing that you can live your life as you choose without somebody else spying on you, without somebody else feeding your choices into an algorithm that will determine some other aspect of your life that you never gave permission for it to determine, then what is that money really going to get you? Is it going to get you freedom? Is it going to get you happiness? Is it going to get you even the things that you expected money to get if other gatekeepers are using certain information about you in ways that you don't want it to be used? And I think people, especially a lot of people with a libertarian bent, have recognized that. I think the entities that are most prone to these kinds of abuses are actually not ideological. They're driven by a kind of short-termism, the quarterly earnings mentality, which is an incentive issue too. The way public corporations are structured in the United States, even if somebody is a good person, and I think actually Larry Page, Sergey Brin, Mark Zuckerberg, even Jeff Bezos are generally good people. But because they have, even Jeff Bezos, but they have publicly traded companies, and they are beholden to their shareholders. If they all of a sudden say, we want to restore the original motto of Google, don't be evil, and we want to consistently follow that, then their shareholders, some activist shareholder associations especially, might decide, well, these CEOs, they're not fulfilling their fiduciary duties, so we're going to sue them for not maximizing profits. And I think that's a problem of institutional design. I'm very much in favor of concepts like benefit corporations, which have an additional purpose besides profit maximization. I also think sole proprietorships, the purer form of capitalism, actually have the potential of greater value alignment, because if the proprietor is a decent individual and the proprietor cares about more than just money, which virtually all decent individuals do, then that person is going to treat their customers well. That person is going to treat their employees well. That person is going to consider what is the impact of my business, my activities on the society in which I want to live. And I think it's also important for every person to see themselves not just as a financial unit, a revenue generating unit, but as a complete human being with other priorities, other goals in life. And how does one advance the whole picture of what one seeks to achieve, the kind of life that one seeks to live, while of course trying to do well in a material sense. And I think technology also helps, because technology lifts those constraints. So if you can live fairly well, even as say a working class person or a middle class person, you're not as incentivized to squeeze every penny. If you have a comfortable material buffer, no matter what happens to your job, no matter what happens to the broader economy, then that allows more room for these more human considerations. I would say the most, let's say, cutthroat or dog-eat-dog kinds of mentalities actually arise when people are on the edges of survival, and when it really matters whether you get the next meal or not for you to engage in certain activities. That's why we have terrible, terrible activities happening in poorer countries of the world, like hunting of endangered species or massive pollution or deforestation. A lot of people engage in these activities, often at the threat to their lives, because those activities are illegal too, because they feel like they need to in order to survive. And it's a very harsh, cynical way of being, but the more prosperous we are, the more possibilities we have to avoid that.
I'd like to believe that's true, and I think, in a macro sense it is true, and yet we see CEOs, and again, I can't speak to the morality or lack of morality of Jeff Bezos or anybody. Again, because these things are, you take a snapshot of one thing, he doesn't treat his workers well. Does that make him evil? I'm not. Look, it certainly doesn't make him, to me, the most honorable person in the world. If you're the richest person, you're paying your employees not the most basic of below minimum wages. That's not, but to me, it's not just the Jeff Bezos stuff. Well, and part of it, I think you're right, is because of this sort of survivalist thing. But we also see it, with big companies on the NASDAQ and so on, who are behaving amorally. So I don't really know how you imbue publicly traded companies that do have this that they have to be aware of their reports. I don't know how we imbue them. Now, sole proprietorships, and again, we see some of the stats in terms of how many there are, and yet we're also seeing, I know as the owner of a sole proprietorship, how hard it is, especially in COVID. So there's one sort of very top line question. I don't expect you to give me the most, because I don't think there is a simple answer to this. But the next thing I wanted to ask you, because I do think it's a real debate, and I know that I'm going to forget otherwise, you talked about privacy as one particular facet of things that we should be concerned about. And there's a big debate, and I'm not sure whether it's a non-debate, that we have to trust, just in terms of COVID, the contact tracing, that we should trust either the government or companies, so that we can get some real data, so that we can stop the curve of COVID. Now, is that a real debate, giving up one's privacy for the health? And what do you think of that? So there's one sort of very broad question, and then there's one more sort of in the weeds type question.
I think it's a genuine discussion that needs to be had. But in terms of privacy, I think it's important to consider that privacy doesn't always mean no data sharing. It just means data sharing with consent and control by the subjects of the data. So it's entirely possible to develop a contact tracing mechanism where people opt in and they agree to share their location. If there are symptoms or contacts that could be shared, they might agree to share those. And as long as each step of that process is undertaken on a consensual or opt-in basis, that could very well be compatible with even the most fervent interpretations of privacy. Now, I do also...
May I just add one caveat, because I think, I mean, it's not, the consent is one thing, and obviously it should be an informed consent where both parties really understand uses, etc. But then the bigger question is trust, is the trust. I mean, in my mind, the biggest question is, you have informed consent, you need to have trust that actually they're going to do what they say they're going to do. So if you could address that too, that's why I interrupted you, because I think there are two prongs to this question.
Yes, and I agree, trust is important. People need to have an understanding that the data they share are going to be used in the way that it is represented that the data will be used. And the more trust people have in that, the more willing they will be to give their consent and openly share their data. I think the reason why a lot of people are having qualms about this today is because they've seen how sometimes the data they share on social media or the data they share with financial services get used by third parties in ways that people did not anticipate. So with contact tracing, if one wants mass participation, it's imperative to design the apps, and it's imperative to design the protocols of what gets done with the data in such a way that people have that confidence that they're not going to be misled, that there aren't going to be some deleterious side effects that nobody would want, that the data isn't going to be used to track people outside of their COVID disease risk, that the data are not going to be used to monitor them for other criminal activity, for example, or monitor their devices after the pandemic has passed. So I think transparency is very important. If the developers of these contact tracing apps come forward and explain in detailed terms what goes into the app, perhaps share the source code, because why not share the source code for these kinds of apps with a public purpose, then I think more people will have the comfort to opt in. And I think generally that is a good design practice. That's why I'm in favor of open source approaches to software where there is transparency and anyone can look at what is being done and question it and suggest improvements.
So how do we create because right now, I mean, I haven't looked at these stats, but I remember, but I think that our trust in government and institutions, even the press, I say even the press, we got a president who's saying that, you know, how do we get back to a place where we trust companies, institutions? I mean, what needs to happen? Because I think what you're saying is, look, the technologies are there, and in a way, the will is there. I mean, you know, for some of these things, but we need to have institutions that we trust. We need to have I mean, I think if I'm reading between the lines, what you're saying is we need to have these institutions and companies that we trust for these things, because they're either the inventors or creators of this technology. And then we also, and we need regulation. We need to, once these things are in place and we have the trust, we need to have real regulation. So tell me about, if you were king for a day, an eon, a millennia, how would you foster these two prongs? And again, if I'm misquoting you or I'm misrepresenting what you're saying, you can also please correct me, because I don't want to do that for sure.
Yes, I think a regulatory framework is important for setting forth the default prerogatives. And in my view, there should be a system of data ownership where individuals own the data about themselves, and then they can choose for each individual data attribute whether they share it or they choose to keep it private. And there should be some rules around transparency of disclosure. So right now, a lot of the social networks, they will have these end user license agreements, which are lengthy and in legalese, and nobody reads because they just want to click through to the functionality. So there needs to be a more intuitive, accessible, transparent interface for giving this consent. And furthermore, there needs to be a better system of positive incentives and rewards. It may be that a social media entity still has a business model around selling people's data to third parties, but in my preferred world, they would disclose this up front, and they would offer a tangible incentive for people to share that information, because the social media companies are making a profit off of data. So ideally, they should be sharing those profits with the owners of the data. It's like if you're a content creator, if you put out a film or you put out a song, you want to receive royalties for it. So likewise, if individuals are putting out their data with their consent, to contribute to the profitability of the social media companies, they should be getting some sort of royalty, some sort of micropayment for it. And I think that will help ease a lot of the economic issues that people are facing, because even the poorest of the poor today are on social media and they're sharing some information about themselves. I think they should be when some of the revenues that the social media companies are generating from that.
I mean, this is a wonderful idea. As you were saying it, I was imagining sort of the lobbyists sort of wringing their hands together, you know, who would be having mini heart attacks for the social media companies. I mean, this sounds wonderful. How do we get this to happen? I mean, there are people. These discussions are happening not just in Congress. I mean, these are happening, you know, in every corner of the world. How does this happen?
Mm-hmm. And you're right, the lobbyists are a formidable obstacle. And I've met a few lobbyists in my time. I've had a few lobbyists as my adversaries as well. But it was interesting for me at one point about 3 years ago to attend a gathering of lobbyists where I was kind of the odd man out, but I listened to a lot of their conversations, and I realized much of what they do is not out of personal conviction. It's also out of necessity. They believe that perhaps only a few of them, the ones that have amassed a lot of savings, the ones that have amassed this kind of venerable reputation as veteran lobbyists over the course of a few decades, have the luxury to go out on a limb and advocate for their own convictions, as opposed to whichever well-resourced clients are paying them. And then I realized, yes, the lobbyists are the instruments of a lot of the harm that goes on in the political system, but even they are perpetrating that harm because they feel constrained, because they don't feel like they have the luxury to follow their judgment. And it dawned upon me that pretty much everyone in contemporary society is in this situation, including the elected politicians, who of course rely on campaign contributions, but also the bureaucrats who take orders from ultimately the elected politicians or their appointees, the ordinary people who have to follow the edicts of the bureaucrats, and also the businesses who are constrained by the regulations that are put into effect, sometimes with, let's say, less than pure motives, because those regulations have been influenced and written by the lobbyists who are beholden to the special interests. On the other hand, the very well-moneyed special interests who are funding the lobbyists may also be constrained, because those could be the same CEOs of publicly traded companies who are beholden to this quarterly earnings mentality, and they couldn't go out and just implement their own wholesale individual visions even if they wanted to. So I think ultimately the solution is to have enough good people in society in positions where they don't have these external constraints upon them. A great example, not a perfect example, is someone like Elon Musk. Now, Elon Musk is running a publicly traded company, many of them. He has a certain attitude that is a bit cavalier, that leads him to sometimes disregard the constraints that other people of other mindsets might see as more binding. But this is a strength for him because he can say, well, I want to revolutionize the world of transportation, or I want to go to Mars, or I want to build a hyperloop, I want to drill tunnels underneath Los Angeles, and try and stop me. And there are enough people who are inspired by this, who see this as daring enough that they buy in, and they keep supporting his projects, they keep his public image afloat, and they essentially keep the money coming as customers, and also, of course, with public opinion that does influence the stock prices of these companies. But I think at every level, one doesn't have to be a multi-billionaire, one doesn't have to be a particularly powerful individual. One just has to have this kind of autonomy to make one's own decisions. And in designing whatever organization one is a part of, whatever movement, whatever social activity, even the way one lives one's own life, it's important to be as little beholden to other people as possible, because then one is free to follow one's own conscience, one's own judgment. And I would say the vast majority of people have some significant amount of decency in them that would be unleashed if only it were allowed to, if they didn't have these cynical survivalist kinds of calculations that they had to engage in. So one question would be, even if one has to do something for survival like that, is there something else that one can do that can be insulated from that? Like perhaps one has a day job where one has to follow all the rules, do what is necessary to advance the objectives of one's company, but then on one's own time, with one's own money, one would have a very principled approach and an unconstrained approach of what good can one achieve. I think this kind of mindset of doing good based on one's conscience and not on external constraints, and helping advance the kinds of technologies, the kinds of ethical and rational discussions that will promote human flourishing, that is what needs to be cultivated in more people. And I think that kind of mindset could come to be viewed pretty much as a civic obligation for what is a worthwhile way to spend one's time if and when one is able to do that.
So, you know, we're in this pandemic, and it's easy to sort of look and say, you know, we could have prevented, or at least prevented some of this. And I guess as somebody who's thought about the future and particularly thought about technology, and FM specifically was such a lightning rod of this telemedicine and teleeducation and all of this stuff, that in a way it kind of knocked some of the optimism out of me personally. It's not saying it's all been knocked out, but what are the lessons that we should be learning or should have learned from where we are now in this pandemic, and how can this be maybe a lightning rod, but something, a beacon of something, so that we can make some of the things that we've just been discussing happen?
Yes, I think the pandemic has shown us that humans are tremendously adaptable, and it has reinforced the adage that necessity is the mother of invention. There have been transitions in the way humans have been working and communicating and learning that probably would have taken at least another decade to fully transpire were it not for this pandemic essentially leaving people with no other choice. But the technologies of telepresence that FM 2030 wrote about are here already, and they are being used already. And I would say there are many positive effects too. It's just those positive effects are masked right now by the tremendous devastation that the pandemic has wrought from a public health standpoint and from an economic standpoint. But I do hope that a lot of these modes of communication, the many virtual meetings and video conferences, the online self-directed learning, the remote work especially, which is liberating to a lot of individuals, are preserved after this pandemic subsides. Because if you have a situation where you can go out and do all of the things in physical space that you think are worth doing, but if something can be done more efficiently in a virtual setting, if you don't have to go to a doctor's office and wait in line and potentially contract some sort of disease, if you just want to talk to your doctor and share your symptoms in the abstract and draw upon the doctor's expertise for what they could be, or if you don't want to sit in a stiff metal chair desk with 30 other kids in order to listen to a lecture, half of which you probably already know, but you want a more custom tailored, more flexible approach to learning, you can still do that, and it's socially accepted, and your health insurance will pay for it, or you'll satisfy graduation requirements for doing that, or you can live anywhere in the world as a knowledge worker and still report to whatever company you want to work for, wherever that headquarters is located. That would be a tremendous boost to human well-being. So I'm still hopeful that that will be done. Now, are these technologies panaceas? No, because we still have our age-old human psychology that sometimes gets in the way. And I think no matter what tools of social interaction we have, we're going to have to contend with this until we have reliable ways of altering the human psyche. And of course, we have Neuralink now, which is in the very early stages, but Neuralink can only do so much. And I think it will be decades before we actually understand how exactly we can improve the functioning of the human brain to reliably avoid these deleterious ways of thinking. Until then, the way we structure our interactions, how we set up the rules of our communication systems, what we allow, what we don't allow, what policies we set, that is going to be the key in making sure these interactions are a net benefit to humanity.
So just to read between the last, pull apart your last thought, you're saying that eventually we'll be able to go in with things like CRISPR or the equivalent and take out the sort of the more aggressive aspects or violent or lizard aspects of our nature and be more empathic, gracious, community-oriented beings. But until we can actually remove those parts from a technological standpoint, we're going to have to just create systems that foster those sorts of traits. Was that a good synopsis of what you said?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it has been successful to a partial extent throughout human history. Steven Pinker writes about this in great detail in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, with regard to how violence has really declined precipitously in the modern world as compared to prior epochs in history. Even the world wars, as devastating as they were, from a per capita standpoint, claimed many fewer lives than the typical tribal skirmish in hunter-gatherer times. So it's possible to succeed through better institutions. It's just that right now, in spite of all of the success that has happened historically, there are still many challenges, there are still many flaws to overcome, and there are still many systems that are not as well designed as they should be.
When we were originally thinking about our movie, I caught a lot of flack for some of the more, I don't know, just some of the plot points, and the plot point, you know, particularly this idea that the whatever technology was going to be used to bring FM back would only be used for us, the elite. And then when the film first came out, this was literally going on in the United States, and I don't think this was hyperbole, where very rich people were getting tested and very rich people were getting treated, and the rest of the country wasn't. I mean, given this and given where we are now, yes, I agree that if we look at the data sets, whether it's infant mortality or literacy, we have improved. And yet some of these things, they may not be as violent, but they're certainly they're certainly not in line with you or I's vision going forward. Well, I didn't even ask you about the movie, but I guess the sorts of problems or themes that we sort of brought up in the movie, are they of concern? Are they real? Were you annoyed by them? Did you hate them? Whatever.
Well, I enjoyed the movie. I think it was definitely a fascinating exploration of these themes and the controversy surrounding them, because in the film, it was clearly illustrated that some people had hostility toward this kind of technological future, toward the prospect of indefinite longevity and reanimating people. But ultimately, the movie also offered hope, especially with the conclusion. I'm not going to spoil it for those who haven't seen the movie, but in my view, the conclusion offered hope that these kinds of advances can give rise to a more humane world, and in essence, another chance for individuals who envisioned a more humane world to see the world of our time and offer their wisdom, their participation in making it better. So I do think every change of that sort, every beneficial change, is a process. And we can't expect everything good to happen right away. There will be setbacks. There will be unequal access at various stages. Just like with every technology, there has been unequal access initially. But as Ray Kurzweil pointed out, every technology goes through stages. Initially, it's very expensive, unreliable, and only available to a few generally wealthy early adopters. But as time passes, as the technology improves, as more companies enter the field and try to make it affordable to more people because they want more market share, then the reliability improves. And as long as there's open access, theoretically, as long as no government is prohibiting the technology, or there's no insurmountable restriction put on by even the private sector, I think the chances of the technology reaching the majority of people in an increasingly fast time frame are very good. Now, there have been setbacks along these lines because of errors in judgment and how those technologies were initially deployed. Google Glass is a great example. I think Google made a tremendous mistake in setting up a closed beta trial where people who weren't part of that trial couldn't purchase Google Glass even if they wanted to. And as a result, the people who got into the trial were seen by everyone else as having some sort of special dispensation, as being some part of an elite that others couldn't opt into, even if they had the money. And that's where the problem comes in. If the barrier is seen as rigid rather than porous, then there will be a backlash. But even if the technology is expensive, but people think that potentially if they meet certain conditions, if they can afford it, or if they wait long enough for it to become affordable, then they could get it, then they will be more optimistic about it. I think what is key is to develop every technology with an awareness and a desire for getting it out to as many people as possible, and sooner rather than later, of course.
Now, you talked, there's a lot of things that would require sort of an ethical, well, not just a discussion, but rules. I mean, particularly when you're talking about CRISPR, and when you're even talking about potentially reanimating people, because the things that we haven't traditionally thought about in our law, in our codes, because these things were almost impossible. I mean, without having you write the code that we should live for the 21st century, but what are some of the, what do you think are sort of the top considerations as we're thinking about the ethical dilemmas or problems when we're thinking of technologies like CRISPR, for example?
Yes. So with CRISPR, of course, I think the key questions are around individual autonomy and choice. In my view, people should have morphological freedom, the right to determine their genetic composition, their appearance, how they present themselves in any way they choose. But of course, the question also has to be asked, is their consent informed? do they know what they're getting themselves into? Because, of course, throughout history, there have been snake oil salesmen or people who just have not completely represented the possible effects. So what does informed consent constitute? If a person is willing to take on certain risks, how does one reasonably set up a framework to say either, yes, you could be exposed to those risks, but those are pretty much it, or at least give people some understanding that an unknown set of risks could happen and they need to really be prepared for that. They need to really be willing to live with that and be under no illusion that there won't be any of those outcomes. So that's one area. The other area, of course.
Can I stop you? By the way, I love the term morphological freedom. I think Zoltan was the first person to introduce me to that. I do love that term. But just to take a step back, I like this discussion, but like even before we get to a place of where we can literally, have wings or, be able to swim underwater or fly or whatever it is, like, in society right now, where I would say that obviously top concerns are health concerns or things that are going to limit, right? Those are sort of number, because I don't think we're literally tomorrow going to have a way that we can have wings, but we can, in theory, have, in theory now, remove certain genes that give us more likelihood to have particular traits or particular diseases. Now, there's got to be some basic system around that before we get to that next stage. That's why I was interrupting you, because I wanted you to give me a sort of framework, because I don't, yes.
Right, and I think the framework should be one that if it errs in the direction of allowing individuals to pursue these modifications, because the cost of inaction and the danger of inaction is sometimes quite high and quite devastating for someone who has Huntington's disease or a predisposition toward a certain cancer or a predisposition toward Alzheimer's disease. Wouldn't it be great to eliminate that predisposition, especially if someone knows that they're really likely to get it? Now, each situation is an individual situation, and I think people need to weigh the benefits and costs carefully, and that includes the state of advancement of the existing technology, the likelihood of side effects, what medical experts think about it, what a person's own risk tolerance is. So the answer in each situation would be an individual answer, but I think what regulators need to refrain from doing is setting a very high bar and saying you absolutely have to demonstrate safety and efficacy in these particular ways before we allow anyone to take on these treatments, because sometimes many people are in a situation where that high bar of safety and efficacy is a luxury that they will not be able to experience no matter what other scenario takes place. So someone is terminally ill already, for example, and this modification, there could be gene therapies. There are even gene therapies available today for certain rare diseases that could treat and cure otherwise terminal ailments. So for a regulator to say, oh, this isn't 100% proven to be safe by a very rigorous regimen of clinical trials, that's essentially condemning those people to death. And I think that is also worthwhile to consider. So I do believe that the more of a possibility there is of being generally fine in the status quo, if somebody is just a young, otherwise healthy individual, but wants a gene therapy to reverse the effects of biological aging 50 years down the road, then there should be more caution undertaken. So I myself am not signing up for any gene therapies yet. I don't want to be in the first generation to do it. I want to be in the second or third generation to do it, but I'm hoping by the time I'm in my late 50s that the technologies will be far enough advanced that it would be a fairly routine medical procedure. You go into a clinic, you get your rejuvenation treatments, maybe you get a few shots administered, and then for the next 10 or 20 years, essentially you're good until your cells senesce again to biological age that you were at before you got the therapies. And then you go in again, but the treatments will have improved since that time. They will be even safer, more reliable, more affordable, and that's how you reach longevity, escape velocity. But the early pioneers, they're going to be taking some risks. The people who are 70 or 80 today, and they want to take advantage of these emerging treatments and live a lot longer, there's going to be some uncertainty as to what effects will arrive. But I have a deep respect for these individuals if they have the courage to undertake it. I have a deep respect for someone like Liz Parrish, the US Transhumanist Party vice presidential candidate, whose most famous action back in 2015 was to be the first person to obtain a combination gene therapy for the purposes of at least attempting to reverse her biological aging. That was a move that could have had a great deal of adverse side effects. It didn't. It ended up being safe for her. But she took on a very informed kind of risk, and she did it in order to advance the field. So I have great admiration for people like that. And the more people like that step forward, ultimately, the more the rest of us humans who are a bit more risk averse will benefit from that.
So I don't know if you've seen the show Upload. I liked it. But the concept is that in the near future, we will be able to upload our consciousness until we can then it will in this way station, and then at a certain point we will be able to unleash it to a different I don't even know what they would call it, but if you could design your upload environment, or have a sort of sense of what you would like, an environment in the future that you would be uploaded to, or choose whatever method of reanimation, what would that look like, feel like? What, for you personally, what are some of the rules or lack of rules that you would have in this second life, let's call it?
Mm-hmm. So I'll give you an answer from perhaps a bit of an unusual perspective, but a really important one. I would want whatever the internal rules of that upload environment are, I would want the physical hardware to be as secure as possible and as reliable as possible, because I would know that if I were digitally instantiated, and let's say it could be done as a kind of gradual upload that preserved the continuity of consciousness just as a thought experiment, I wouldn't want the underlying substrate to be jeopardized in any way. So I would want it to be in some sort of ultra secure facility with continuous access to electricity, internet, backup generators, multiple redundancies, what have you. And I really feel like from an intellectual standpoint, I could occupy myself in any world. I could figure out ways to spend my time. I've never been the kind of person who would get bored. I think only boring people get bored. So whatever that environment was, I would explore it. I would find interesting ways and interesting rules to observe within that system, or creations that I could undertake. And if you have a world, say like Minecraft, where you have a fairly basic set of rules, even, it's a procedurally generated world, you have not too vast an array of blocks, but a decent array of blocks, but you can build anything with it. So if you have this kind of open-ended world where you have a set of fathomable rules, but the range of things you can do within that structure is potentially inexhaustible, yes, I could be occupied for an indefinite amount of time doing that until somebody is able to reinstantiate me in a physical body. If that's the way it goes, that wouldn't be such a bad fate, but I need to make sure that at the level I wouldn't be able to control, the physical hardware, nobody has the ability to switch that off. No cataclysm, no social disruption is able to jeopardize that, because that is the greatest vulnerability for these kinds of virtual entities. That's the greatest vulnerability for AI in the future as well. Some people think, oh, if we have sentient artificial general intelligence, it will take over the world because it will be so much more powerful and intelligent than humans. But keep in mind, the sentient AIs could be frailer than Stephen Hawking was. Stephen Hawking was one of the most intelligent people of human history, but he had to depend on a lot of external support and a lot of externally designed technology to get to the point where through the twitch of his lip, he could type on his computer and communicate his brilliant thoughts. I think a lot of the sentient AGIs, if and when they are developed, are going to be in a similar situation. They're going to be brilliant and very helpful potentially, but they're going to be constrained in these ways and vulnerable. So if I were ever in such a position, I would want to protect myself from the physical vulnerabilities as much as possible.
You know, it's funny, I hadn't even exactly thought of that, but because the usual narrative is that these, whether you believe in a positive or a negative outcome, is that these overlords will be overlords, and they will master over us. Perhaps not in a aggressive way, perhaps in a benevolent way, but it's always been framed that way, even by the likes of Ray Kurzweil and Elon Musk even. In fact, I did this interview with Steve Jurvetson where he said that specifically. But this kind of changes that dynamic if whatever they're running on all protects them. I mean, it's interesting. I hadn't actually thought of it like, I hadn't thought of that. But you'd be content like using blocks for eternity, or at least part of eternity, because you'd figure out ways to create really interesting shit out of the blocks.
Absolutely, I would.
I believe you. I actually believe that you would. I've every faith in you that we would see edifices made of these blocks that we'd never seen before. I actually buy into that. Last couple of questions, really. How, it's a sort of silly question, but like, how optimistic are you? What makes you so optimistic about the future, and then what curbs it? What's your biggest fears and biggest hopes?
Yes, so I would say I am cautiously optimistic for the medium to long term. I'm not as optimistic for the very short term. I think in the short term, given the pandemic, given the economic crises, given the social unrest, we're going to have to muddle through in some way that preserves as much as possible of what we value, the good things in our society and the prerequisites for further advancement. But the technologies that can really revolutionize our lives and lead them to pursue a dramatically better course are either already here or right on the horizon. The question is, will there be the will for humans to deploy these technologies? I think it will be very informative to see what happens to this push for vaccines against COVID-19. I'm one of the people who believe we need as many vaccine candidates out there as possible, as soon as possible, to end this pandemic and to help us move on to the next stage. But really, in my study of the history of human civilizations, the rise and fall of prior advanced civilizations, I think it's imperative to avoid what I would call a cascade of failures. One could argue, for instance, that the Antonine Plague that affected the Roman Empire in the late 2nd century CE set off a chain reaction of events that very slowly over the course of centuries contributed to the ultimate collapse of the Western Roman Empire. And then the Byzantines tried to hold out in the Eastern Roman Empire for almost another 1,000 years. But even so, because this cascade built upon itself, they could not avert the decline. They could not restore their society to the old glory and state of advancement of the Roman Empire at its peak. So my key concern is, how do we take out as many of those potential falling dominoes as possible while we're still in a state where we generally have the infrastructure for the kind of progress after the pandemic that we want to have. So I would say the more quickly we get this under control, the more quickly we return to some semblance of a reasonable, sane existence, the easier it will be in the longer term to get to that future. If this pandemic drags on for 3 or 4 years, I think my confidence will wane. If it drags on for another year, I think we have a good fighting chance still. But I'm really hoping for a vaccine by the end of 2020. And this will also be a good proof of concept for whether human societies can accelerate the pace of research and deployment of new medical technologies in the face of a sufficiently urgent need. Now, I think a reorientation of public consciousness around biological aging is also essential, because what is the number one risk factor for COVID-19? It is biological aging. The median age of death from COVID-19 is in the 80s. And that's not because age is some magic number. It's because a lot of the people who are most vulnerable, they have other pre-existing conditions. They have been ravaged by senescence already, so they're an easier target for a coronavirus. They're also an easier target for the influenza virus and other infectious diseases. So if people come to understand that if we defeat biological aging, these pandemics will be a much lesser threat in the future, I think we can do a lot of good in advancing the technologies that can help reverse biological aging within our lifetimes as well. So I would say this is a testing ground for humanity, essentially. Can we beat back this kind of enemy, which is still a fairly straightforward kind of enemy? Can we unite as humankind and overcome our differences and focus on what really matters, which is rolling out the technology to win this fight? And then if we can do that, I'm very hopeful about the future. If humankind fractures and divides and turns in on itself, and people continue to viciously attack one another in even more devastating ways, then that will hold back progress. But these are the two forces: the better parts of our nature, the better angels of our nature, and the demons of our nature, so to speak, that are at odds right now. And you know which side I am on, which side I'm hopeful will win. And I hope there are enough of us that will push that side forward.
I hope so too. I mean, the only thing that you made me think about, I don't think it's will. Well, it's certainly not individual will. I think it's much more this idea of, can we have a sort of collective, a collective will? Is that possible, that permeates from the individual to the greater public? I mean, that's the only nitpicky thing I have to say about your description. Thank you very much indeed. Is there anything else that you want me to know, or want anybody to know about you? Well, you have a great name as well. Where is your name from? We didn't. Well, just tell me about your name.
I was originally born in what is now Belarus, what was then the Soviet Union, and I came to the United States at the age of 9, so I've spent most of my life here. But Belarus right now is ruled by an authoritarian dictator, Alexander Lukashenko, and for those who have been following the situation there, Lukashenko has fabricated many of the elections that have led him to keep power, but the latest fabrication was so blatant that people came out in the hundreds of thousands to protest his misrule, and he has responded with extreme brutality, essentially abducting people, random people in the streets, having them beaten by his police forces, tortured. Some people have been killed, and yet people continue to come out and protest in a completely peaceful and orderly manner. They don't want to violently overthrow him, they just want him to go. And it's just an amazing contrast between the violence, the brutality of the regime, and these peaceful, extremely benevolent, ordinary people who are coming out to protest in the streets. And I think that is a model for social change. Protests can be good or bad depending on how they are deployed and what tactics are used. But if one wants to really combat and confront injustice, then it's imperative, I think, to take the moral high ground, to act out of conviction. Sometimes it takes courage, but to do it in a way that really shows what the right side of the issue is. So I think with regard to my country of origin, I really hope that that could be an example of a positive transformation. We'll see what happens in the coming weeks and months, but if the people of Belarus can do it, then perhaps that kind of collective will you spoke about will be reinforced in the rest of the world.
Thank you. I really hope so. I mean, there's so many terrible things going on, and as you point out, there's lots of wonderful things too. So let's hope that we move in a more positive direction. We get on the backs of I don't know, positive, the better, actually this is much better. We get on the backs of the angels, the angels that you talked about, the angels that are the better angels of our nature. We get on those wings and not something else. Thank you for all the work that you do, and I so appreciate your time, really. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny. I really enjoyed our conversation.